we're going to talk about now is how the industry is coping with it, what are the natural things that come out of it, and coolcationing is one of them. So let's just go into that a bit more with my very special panel. So can I please welcome on stage Claire Hanney, Managing Director from the Travel Corporation, recently the subject of a high-profile acquisition by Apollo. Yes, and with a new MD for the travel section, or the
same role.
Which is you?
Managing Director for the travel industry. Yeah.
Take a seat, please.
Thank you.
Can I also please bring on stage from Trip.com the Director, Destination Marketing, Senior Director, Destination Marketing, Jane McFadzean. Hello, Jane. Have a seat. And Andy Fairburn, please come up. He's the co-founder, director, Nordic Tourism Collective. Yeah. How you doing? Take a seat. There's a mic for you. So, let's go into this a bit more. Andy, I'll start with you. Actually, before I say just one thing I do want to comment on, by the way. There is a lot of man-made climate change in the world, and I was intrigued to hear from one of the two presidential candidates in the US, I won't say who, but commenting on rising sea levels, I gave it away, said recently, no one knows if that's true or not. I think we do, and I think we know what is actually happening in the real world. And I want to ask you, Andy, first of all, what is this drift towards what we call coolcationing?
Well, coolcation is exactly what you described in your intro, Rajan. We have seen months, if not solid, high temperatures in the southern Mediterranean, and there is a trend for people to look for alternative destinations which are cooler. So my association is a community-based association which spans the entire Nordic region from Greenland in the far west all the way to Lithuania in the far east. And that's a colder destination. And we have seen an increase in visitors who are choosing cooler destinations to visit because they don't want to visit southern Mediterranean destinations in the heights of summer. And this is something which seems to be an inevitable trend. It's still slightly anecdotal how substantial that trend is, but I think it is an inevitability. I think that the interesting thing is that it does present lots of opportunities for destinations who need tourism. As Julia sort of said earlier, there are some destinations, particularly in my region, which is the colder Nordic regions, where actually more tourism would be very beneficial for economic reasons and for social reasons, etc. But it's also something we need to manage and we need to be prepared for. Because the reason people travel to, say, for example, Norway in the first place, is that it's a very large country with a very small population. People go there for the nature, people go there for the wide open spaces, and that's why people go there. If you then start increasing the tourism, then you're destroying what you've got. So there's mixed feelings in the Nordic region about this whole concept. So there's a very strong camp which says, yes, this is something that we see and we welcome, and it gives us an opportunity to develop economically in areas and at times of the year where we wouldn't normally do that. It also gives us an opportunity to maybe extend seasons a little bit. I know, we'll come on to seasonality a little bit as well. It gives us the opportunity to sell diverse destinations, which Julia also alluded to earlier. But it's also very dangerous because there's a real reticence in the Nordics about, this sounds great, but do we really want this? We need to be careful here because we don't want to get into a mess. We want to make sure that we're going to prepare for coolcations, or we're going to prepare for an increase in visitors. We need to make sure we do it right. And that's it's a sort of warning flag. And lots of people are worried that actually it's not also something we should be celebrating necessarily, because climate change is inherently a bad thing. So we shouldn't be saying, hey, come to the Nordics because it's hot in Spain. The communication message also needs to be very carefully managed as well.
We're going to come on to the way that you deal with that, manage that, in a sense, in terms of dispersal, for example, a bit later. But, I mean, I'm just going to give you one thing I've noticed. The Northern Norway Tourism Board is thrilled to announce a record-breaking summer for the region with a remarkable 2.3 million overstays recorded between June and August of this year. 1.1 million of those were international visitors, was a 9% increase. Now that, I think, is quite typical, isn't it, of a lot of places in the Nordics?
Yes, it is. And I would also add that the Norwegian krona is suffering from a 5-year low. So actually Norway is now a cheap place to visit, and it wasn't. So that's also a factor which we do have to consider. The other thing as well is also Northern Norway Tourist Board also recently put out a press release where they stopped the promotion of nature as a tourist incentive, if you like. Because in Norway they have something called Moderator, which basically means you can walk everywhere. So there are no you can walk anywhere in Norway. So there's a fear that if there is more tourists, then we're going to have people walking all over the country. So they're very protective of their nature. They're very protective of their environment. So again, it's a real balancing act between good and bad on this.
But there is basically a chance for us to get this right this time. I think we were talking yesterday, and you were talking about Benidorm in the 70s and the parallels, if you like.
Well, no, I think in 1949, in the UK, for example, Horizon Holidays was the first charter package holiday company, and they chartered a plane from Gatwick to, actually, I think it went to Corsica, but I'd use Torremolinos as an example. So Torremolinos was a tiny little fishing village in south of Spain, and then that was in early 1960s. And then the whole thing exploded, and the whole of the costas were ruined. So basically what I'm saying is that the Nordic guys are sitting there saying, we do not want this to happen in Scandinavia. You know, we're very proud of what we've got, we're very pleased, we're proud of our culture and our societies and everything we care for very deeply. So yes, let's welcome tourism because it's going to come, but let's make sure that we get all, as we say in English, our ducks in a row. We'll make sure we do it properly because we don't want to get into a mess which the cost had got into in the 1960s.
Claire, first of all, are you seeing travellers, consumers, being alarmed and affected and changing their travel habits because of extreme weather events?
I think there's a large number of factors that go into guests changing their behaviour, and while on the surface it would appear that guests are shifting towards Coolcationing, for example. We had a record April and October last year, whereas typically our peak months are May and September, but certainly April and October exploded for us, and we saw a dip in July last year. So if on the surface you look at that, it looks like people are moving towards cooler months, but there are a number of factors that go into that. For example, I made the decision 2 years ago when we went on sale for those months to seriously increase our capacity in those months, simply because there was more availability. A lot of the regions that we travelled to, including the Nordic countries, were closed in a lot of regions in April. 10 years ago, they just were, our season starts in May, and we pressured our suppliers to start opening earlier because we recognised that we could extend the season, thereby improving sustainability by getting rid of some of the peaks and troughs throughout the year, and that strategy has paid off. It also contributed this year that France had the Olympics. That always turns away a lot of tourists throughout Europe, throughout the region in that particular time. And also air prices went extremely high in that month, which meant that more people were looking for other options. There was a lot of press this year in summer about the extreme heat, which was absolutely fair. There was a lot of extreme heat, so I think that put pressure on people. So it definitely is a factor in shifting tourism, but it's not the only factor. But also the kinds of travel that we offer now do sway towards Coolcationing. It didn't exist for our guests a few years ago. We now have a lot more tours that go to travel to see the Northern Lights, for example, in Scandinavia and in Alaska and in other locations where the Northern Lights are visible. So they're natural phenomenon that happen in the winter. But I think that the infrastructure available is much better than it used to be in the cooler climes, which has allowed us to be able to increase our tourism there. But again, it's one of a number of factors that go into making those decisions.
Because the other aspect of this as well is that outdoor travel, outdoor hiking, all those things are much more, more popular now, and people are doing that, and that tends to be in higher altitudes in cooler places.
Certainly, and I think that we're much more transparent with our guests now on the level of activeness that's required on our trips, so that they can join the very active trips. And in lots of locations, there's active travel available. Certainly, even in the hotter climes, people are wanting active travel. But when it comes to active travel, people are looking for nature-based opportunities more than they were, and I think that's a clear trend, that looking for nature, and you can see that by what people are searching for on our websites, and you can see that by what people are searching for on Google, and cooler climes tend to lend themselves beautifully, or cooler times of year. It's not even cooler climes, it's not necessarily the cold places. By coolcationing, I'm not only talking about going to a place that used to have a glacier, I'm also talking about sorry, that was a bit sarcastic, I think. Sorry about that. I'm talking about places that are also the cooler times within hot destinations, or the off-peak times within destinations. And I think that that's really key to helping sustainable tourism in the future.
So it's that whole notion of shoulder season,
correct,
spreading it out over the year. I mean, these are in a way are good effects of this trend, of climate change.
Absolutely, and I think it opens people's minds to travel in times that they wouldn't usually travel. I've been an advocate of travelling in the off-peak season since I started travelling, because I love it. I love the fact that you've got fewer people around. I love the fact that you've got an easier path through airports. I love the fact that museums are empty. All of those reasons, I've been on stages for 20 years talking about, rabbiting on about the fact that you should travel in off-peak seasons, especially when I'm talking direct to consumers. But it's good to see, finally, that those messages are paying off. But unfortunately, I think they're paying off for the wrong reasons. They're paying off because we're seeing the effects of climate change now, and people are starting to believe what they've heard about for a very long time, and the bad effects of over-tourism are real. You know, we have been working really hard with destinations to make sure that we have our footprint there when it's the lowest time of day and year, to be able to put our footprint into destinations so that our guests don't feel it, because we don't want our guests to feel that over-tourism feeling either. We don't want the local community to feel it. We don't want our guests to feel it. So if we can help destinations to shift the spread, and that means that they have to get on board as well and be open for business. They've got to get on board, and I was just in Capri last week, and it was shutting down. The whole of Capri was shutting down. Now, good on them for having a holiday. However, if they stayed open there's no reason they can't stay open another month or two, because it's beautiful weather there. It was ridiculous, and they were all shut. The hotels were shutting up shops, the restaurants were shutting up shops, and it meant that's forcing the tourism into that peak time, and it means that they are overcrowded in the peak times.
Jane, Trip.com, huge group, global group. Tell me, first of all, are you seeing, same question I asked Claire, are you seeing travellers being alarmed, changing their habits because of climate change?
So we're coming at it with a bit of a different perspective. So just to give you a bit of context, Trip.com Group, one of the world's largest travel providers. We consist of a number of market-leading brands, Trip.com, Ctrip, and Skyscanner. So we have the luxury or the privilege to see these trends in real time, because we have access to a huge amount of data. So there's sort of two ways that I'll answer this question. So one, we are seeing an increase to the types of destinations that we just talked about. So we're seeing a marked increase to Norway, Iceland, Scotland. I had to get that in, obviously. Of course.
And not just Edinburgh.
Not just Edinburgh, Glasgow, and we've actually done a lot of work ourselves with Visit Scotland. But so we are seeing an increase there, and that increase is being driven by Gen Z. So those born in the 90s, not the 90s, but born in the 90s, making up for about 55% of that increase. So we are seeing that. But what I think is really important is that we kind of see that as a pull factor. So like we said, the outdoor appeal, the wellness, all of those sort of that type of experience that those destinations provide, we see that as a draw factor. There is the push factor, but we definitely see that as the pull factor. But also, it's, as with everything that we talk about, it's all about the balance. So what we're seeing with our sort of, let's call them the more traditional, hotter destinations, we are also seeing that off-shoulder. We talk about it in three ways: off-shoulder, shoulder, off-peak, and off the beaten track. And so we are seeing those, and we're working really hard with our destinations in those regions to extend the season, to have our travellers extend their stays. And one of the ways that we see our role in that is that we are sort of embedding that into our AI tools, so into our itinerary planners. So when our customers are coming onto the site or customers coming onto our app, they're being those sort of sustainable travel options and tips and tricks are being sort of shown to them so they can make those decisions in a really sort of thoughtful way. And we really just see our key role in here is making sure that all of our consumers have all the best choices, all the best information, all the most relevant choices, so they can make the decisions, the best decisions for themselves.
Now, a theme of this conference is collaboration. We have talked about issues, Andy, you mentioned a few just then, when you just basically get a whole flood of tourists going to one destination in the north rather than in the Mediterranean or whatever, which causes a similar sort of problem, right? So, I mean, I made a documentary earlier this year, and we went to Bohinj in Slovenia, which is about 2 hours away or an hour away from Lake Bled, which is near the capital, which is where a lot of tourists would go. Now, the whole point that Bohinj was trying to do was trying to get, the whole point was that tourists would go there instead of Lake Bled as somewhere to go as an alternative destination. The trouble was, April, it was absolutely chock-a-block. So we are talking about that issue of the problem, if you like, just going to somewhere else. So how, in terms of collaboration, do, for example, members of your collective work together to make sure that places that do want more tourists and could benefit from more tourists get them, as opposed to the Oslos and the Copenhagens of this world?
I think we have the advantage in the Nordic region is that the Scandinavians are generally collaborative by nature anywhere. So they don't make decisions without having a long meeting about it. So I think that the Scandinavians really enjoy the notion of discussing something over and over and over again. But I think that this collaboration thing is interesting because, I mean, my background's in marketing, and I'm sure there's lots of marketers here. And when you attend marketing school or you go to some sort of marketing course, they teach you about competitive advantage. And competitive advantage is the driver behind marketing. It's how do you get better than your competitor? How do you get an advantage over your competitor? How do you pull away from your competitor by getting that edge on them and taking their market share? That's the sort of bedrock of marketing in effect. And we've seen a shift, particularly in the Scandinavian regions, to this notion of collaborative marketing, where basically the power of working together is more powerful than working individually against each other. And it's a real thing, and it's definitely within, certainly, and the good example of this is in the Arctic region. So in the Arctic region, you've got Lapland essentially, which is part Finnish, part Swedish, and part Norwegian. So the Finns would only market the Finnish bit, and the Swedes would only market the Swedish bit, and the Norwegians would only market the Norwegian bit. But actually what they've done is they've got together under it's an EU-funded project, actually. It's like a 6-year project. It's called Visit Arctic Europe. And what they're doing is they're getting all the various stakeholders in the region to talk about how can we develop tourism together in this region to promote the Arctic as a destination. And it's been hugely successful. They've got about 130 or so individual supplier members, and they range from hotels to DMOs to activity companies. And they market it as the Arctic region. So they're getting away from the usual silos and the usual confines of individual destinations. And it involves the destinations, it involves the accommodation sector, the transportation sector, and the political sector as well. And that's the key thing, is really, again, the local governments and the politicians involved to make them understand the realities that go on.
And in terms of collaboration, Jane, Travelist is something that you're very keen on, isn't it?
Yes, yes. So we've already heard a little bit about it from Virginia this morning. So we're really proud partners, really proud part of the coalition that is Travelist. And like we said earlier, to have all of our quote unquote competitors in the room working together to just even start talking the same language, right? Talking the same language, working together in terms of best practices and best solutions. We feel that this, collaboration is at the heart of everything we try to do in terms of sustainable travel. But it's not just Travelists. We collaborate with GSTC. That helps us stay really aligned with industry practices. So if we look, Travelist feels like best practices within our particular world. GSTC, we work with them to have industry best practice, but talking a little bit more there about specific regions. We also collaborate with people like WWF, which therefore, help us to really understand the impact that we're having in certain communities, certain regions, and then how can we work together with them on things like the sustainability report that I mentioned a minute ago. So we collaborate across the board. The Travelist piece, I think, is a real standout piece because of the immense amount of progress that they've made in terms of, helping us implement the TIM model and another of other ways that we can show lower carbon emission flights to our users. But I could sum it up in 3 words: collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. That's really sort of the approach that we're taking to this particular area.
Claire.
Well, I love collaboration. We work really strongly with our competitors, actually, and with other people in the industry to try to shift our sustainability goals. When it comes to coolcationing, I actually think it's the opposite of collaboration. And the reason I think it's the opposite of collaboration is because we start where the travel industry finishes. We're pushing people to come along on the journey with us that aren't on the journey yet. And I guess that is dragging them along to collaborate. But these aren't people who want to collaborate with you. These are people who are... Actually, our season finishes here. Thanks very much. I'm going to bed. I'm not going to give you airlift because there's not. It's working to be able to explain the benefits of shifting the seasons. It's working to be able to explain the benefits of going to places that other people aren't yet going, so that we're able to be at the forefront. And I don't think that you can bring all the players together in an environment that doesn't yet exist. It's about trying to find those locations. And you were talking about Torremolinos, for example, earlier. I know in Lauterbrunnen in Switzerland, for example, the Travel Corporation started going there 60 years ago. I know this because 50 years ago, my mother went there on a camping tour with Kentucky. And in 1973, I have pictures of it. And it's a tiny village. And it's a tiny village built around a campsite that Kentucky still uses 60 years later. And it's still a tiny village. It's been able to keep its character, but it's been able to offer tourism in a place that is different and special. And it's become one of the highlights of the trip for Kentucky travellers globally that they share with their friends and family back home. But it's been able to retain that small village feel. And I think that it's being able to create secondary destinations or improve secondary destinations through tour operators like ourselves that mean that it doesn't come up first on Google, thank God. It doesn't come up first on, you're never going to see it on Skyscanner, you're never going to see it on those, but we'll fly with you. we'll book our flights, we'll get there, but then on the ground transportation can take you to places that are off the beaten track and secondary destinations. And a lot of our future travel development is about increasing the use of the secondary destinations. We might have to land in gateway locations, but we take people off the beaten track and at times that aren't typical, so that they can experience the cooler climes in the way that they want to and in the way that doesn't impact the local communities.
I want to just ask you two in particular about, unfortunately, the negative side of this, which is with climate change, certain destinations which are popular now, and yes, they may become more popular in the what you call the shoulder season, but nonetheless, it is a big potential, well, it is a big crisis for traditional Mediterranean destinations that might actually, in the summertime, be off limits for people. Are you working towards realising that?
Absolutely, and I'm watching issues across Mediterranean countries, but I'm not concerned about that for the travel industry. I am concerned about that for those individual destinations because they have to do more to be able to push travellers to other times of year, frankly. Airlift has a big part in that to play. If we had better availability and cheaper prices throughout the off-peak seasons, we'd be able to bring more guests in at those times. But there's always destinations that change over time. And I think Iceland is the classic example. This is not a trend towards Iceland increasing. Iceland booms and busts more times than I can count. Like it increases its number of travellers so much so that everyone gets greedy in Iceland, and then they increase their prices, and then the number of travellers drops, and then they decrease their prices, and then Iceland gets popular. And I've watched this cycle happen in Iceland. It's like every 7 years or something, and that's not a coolcationing trend. That's just it's on the up at the moment because it's its time, because it reduced its prices 4 years ago. Great. So when I look at those kinds of things, I know that people will want to travel, and there's an increasing number of people who have the means to be able to travel globally. So I mean that emerging economies like India and China mean that there are far more people with the available funds to want to see the rest of the world, which is why we're seeing such increase in numbers across the board. And destinations, rightly so, will put in place barriers to travel in terms of pricing to be able to reduce or increase the profit from a lower number of people, so that they're able to make the money but not be overwhelmed by the number of tourists that are coming through those locations. So I see that the potential here for destinations is required if they're becoming over tourism places, to put in place those barriers. And we can see it all through Italy. There's and all through many cities, in pedestrianising cities, stopping ways of forcing people onto public transport to be able to get around those kinds of things, to be able to improve the way that their cities are operating or their countries are operating from a tourism perspective. And we have to work with that.
But I guess what I'm also saying is that, for example, in July and August, I know certain Greek islands will just be, we won't go there. I mean, we don't go to Dubai so much, for holidays,
Sure.
to Dubai and Abu Dhabi or whatever.
That's normal. That part, it's not normal that these islands are, like, I'm not saying climate change is normal by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying that it's normal that we don't go to certain places in certain times of year, but it does mean that we'll go to them in other times of year. Greece is still nice in October and November, so we'll see more people travelling during those times. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be doing everything we can to be reducing our carbon, which is why we are setting net zero goals, and we have scientifically backed net zero goals, and we're really working hard towards that. Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's less. We don't necessarily see it as an opportunity. It's a shift, and everything is constantly shifting. And so what we do, and what we continue to do, is make sure that we're sharing our data with our destinations in a really thoughtful way that helps them to use that data to make sure that they have the right product in place off season, the right infrastructure to get that dispersal throughout their region, whether that's through rail or whether that's through, you can on our app, we can now choose electric vehicles. It's making sure that we're sharing that data in a timely manner with our destinations, just to continue to find that balance for the shifts. Because, like Claire said, it's things that, Iceland is a great example. I completely agree with you. And it's just making sure that we are sharing the data that's going to help them get prepared. It's learning as well from what's happened. I think, we're making sure we're getting ahead of the problem and helping them sort of navigate through.
So the travel industry will cope. Obviously, for the local destinations, climate change is a huge problem, and maybe the industry has a responsibility to those places as well.
I don't know if fewer tourists in July and August in Italy is going to be a problem. I mean, a lot of people want a holiday in August in Italy and have done for 30 years, and the only industry that's open in August in Italy is tourism. So do they care if tourism closes in August? I reckon they'd be okay.
It was really interesting insight came out of a report recently that said the majority, which was 35% of our consumers, see it as a shared responsibility. So when they say shared, that comes into three buckets: the individual, governments, and the travel industry. So that's the consumer telling us is that they see it as a shared responsibility, which I think is right and good for us to know.
Andy, you were going to...
Oh, no, I was just going to throw in an anecdote about Iceland. I mean, Iceland's a great example. It's having a downturn at the moment. But I think the interesting thing is that Rajan, I think there is an opportunity for many tour operators. There's a massive opportunity for many destinations. And certainly everything we've talked about, I mean, in terms of seasonality, so going back to the Scandinavia, for example, yes, you can go to Norway in April and it's not going to be freezing cold. It's going to be very pleasant. So go to Norway in April, etc., etc. And so you can promote these destinations which perhaps were not top of everybody's list to start with. These so-called secondary destinations. You could extend the seasonality and all that, but there are downsides. And long-term infrastructural planning needs to be done by the destinations and by the local governments and the political forces. There can be a tendency for a disconnect between politicians and the travel industry. And interesting that the travel industry has now got a spot at the COP, which is the first time that travel has been recognized as a force, and it's a huge employer of people and huge generator of income, but it's never been actually recognized as such. So there are huge opportunities, but it has to be done properly. And the final thing I'd like to say is really we need to communicate this somehow, because whilst there are opportunities to be gained, we can't ride on the back of climate change as being a good thing. Because hey, don't go to Spain, go to Norway. We just can't do that. So the communication of how we talk about this is very delicate, and we need to make sure that we get the messaging absolutely spot on.
But I would say that, in a sense, of course, we can't be happy about what's happening to the world because of climate change. But these are inevitable shifts we are seeing, right? This is irreversible.
I think the trend is inevitable. It will happen. I think weather volatility is something which you haven't talked about, and I think you're going to get sort of rises. And I mean, living in London like I do, we have had the worst summer this year I can possibly remember. So everybody in the UK, they want to go to Spain this summer because they want some sunshine. So you're going to get these blips, and you're going to get these weird sort of weather peaks and troughs. But I think overall the trend is like this, and I think there will be a particularly also with the increase in wellness, as you described, about people seeking nature, people seeking more active types of vacations, and I think the trend does lead itself very much to that.
But what we are, we've got to wrap up, but what we are talking about is a paradigm shift. I just want to make this clear, because this isn't just a trend that's going to last a year or two. It is a paradigm change. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we see booking trends, I'm sure you see booking trends, mirroring that. People are booking a tour a week or two out. That never used to happen, ever. They're waiting to see what will the weather be like. Will it be a nice time to travel? And then they're going.
Yeah. I'm actually curious if there's anybody who wants to ask a question, because this is quite an interesting point. And if you want to ask a question, you're very welcome. We've got a minute or two left. So if there is, show your hands now. Don't worry if you don't, because we're heading towards a coffee break anyway. I'll deal with that. I just want to ask you one last question, which is, what advice would you give to destinations in, for example, the Nordic area who do want tourists and would welcome them in what we now regard as being peak months in the summertime? What advice to the ones that can cope with it?
Well, I think it goes back to the C word, which is collaboration, and they need to get all the stakeholders together. They need to agree with when we touched on communities earlier this morning about your example of being an extra in your own film.
Yep.
They need to get the local communities, need to let all the various stakeholders involved, get them all around a big table and talk about what needs to be done and what they're really looking for. It is a paradigm shift. It's a strategic move. It needs to be done properly. You can't just go at it piecemeal here and there in bits and pieces. And also around that big table, get these guys in as well, because these guys provide the data. These guys actually provide the visitors. So, what are the trends on the ground? What can the tour operators, how can they help? How can the politicians help? Just get everyone together and look long term rather than short term.
And you would say, Jane, using your data, that attitudes amongst travellers, the majority of travellers, are, again, different.
Yeah.
They are looking elsewhere.
Yeah.
They're changing their traditional way of travelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final, just to sort of wrap that bit up for you, is that, we're definitely seeing with Gen Z, they're aligning their personal values with their travel, right? So their personal values on sort of sustainability, the way that they see the world, the way they see the environment. And, you know, my last data fact is, you know, that 53% of Gen Zs, that's, you know, top of their list when they're looking at their sustainable travel choices. So they're really seeing that they're starting to align their own personal values with the way that they choose their travel.
Okay, well, these guys will be around if you want to talk to them for the rest of the conference. We've had a good morning session, and I think we all deserve a coffee. 15 minutes. It's just outside here. Don't go very far away. Thank you very much indeed, panel.